If you're so confident you're marrying our son for love, then signing a $10,000 prenup shouldn't bother you at all, my future mother-in-law said as she slid the document across the table. The room went quiet after that. Even the soft piano music playing through the restaurant speakers seemed to fade into the background. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting in front of me, and then slowly lifted my eyes to meet hers. Diane Walker sat perfectly upright in her chair, her pearl necklace resting neatly against her navy blouse, her expression calm and polite in the way people often are when they believe they have all the power. Beside her, Richard Walker folded his hands together and watched me carefully. Across from me sat Ryan, my fiancé, staring at the table instead of looking at me. That hurt more than the document itself. I smiled softly and folded my hands in my lap. Nobody at that table knew that the trust fund established by my grandfather decades earlier was quietly paying for the house the Walker family proudly called their own. Nobody knew because I had never told them. My grandfather used to say that money revealed character faster than almost anything else. For years, I thought he was exaggerating. That evening, I realized he had been right. 3 months earlier, when Ryan proposed to me during a weekend trip to Cape Cod, everything had seemed simple. The ocean breeze had carried the scent of salt water through the air. The sun had been setting behind the harbor. Ryan had gotten down on one knee and asked me to spend my life with him. I said yes without hesitation. At the time, I believed I was saying yes to a future built on trust. Looking back now, I think that was the last uncomplicated moment before everything changed. The first time I met Diane and Richard Walker, they were welcoming enough. They invited me to family dinners, asked polite questions, and smiled at all the appropriate moments. But over time, I began noticing a pattern. Diane never asked what books I enjoyed reading or where I dreamed of traveling. Instead, she asked where I rented my apartment, how much student debt I had, and whether my job included retirement benefits. Richard wasn't much different. He always seemed interested in numbers, salary, savings, investments, property values. At first, I assumed they were simply practical people. Then I started feeling as though every conversation was an evaluation. Every answer I gave seemed to earn an invisible score. The strange thing was that I could have ended their curiosity at any moment. I could have explained that my grandfather's trust had been established long before I was born. I could have explained that I had never needed anyone else's money. I could have explained that the investment company managing the trust owned assets spread across several states. But my grandfather had also taught me something else. Never rush to prove your worth to people determined to underestimate you. So I said nothing. I lived comfortably, but modestly. I drove a 6-year-old sedan. I worked because I enjoyed my career. I paid my own bills. The assumptions people made about me were rarely corrected, including the assumptions made by the Walker family. Diane cleared her throat and gently tapped the prenup papers with one manicured finger. "This protects everyone," she said. "You understand that, don't you?" I nodded slowly. Of course. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. I think she expected resistance, maybe even outrage. Instead, I turned the first page and calmly began reading. The document outlined what would happen if the marriage ended. It protected Ryan's savings, future earnings, and potential inheritance. The amount that caught my attention wasn't the protection itself. It was the $10,000 clause Diane seemed so proud of. It was written as though it represented serious financial security. I almost laughed, not because $10,000 was insignificant. For many families, it was a meaningful amount of money. But compared to what I knew, the number felt strangely small. Still, I kept my face perfectly neutral. Across the table, Ryan finally looked at me. There was uncertainty in his eyes, maybe even guilt, but he remained silent. I realized then that the prenup wasn't the real issue. The issue was trust, and trust was becoming harder to find by the minute. I closed the document gently and rested my hand on top of it. Diane leaned forward slightly, waiting for my answer. Richard watched me closely. Ryan held his breath. I smiled and reached for the pen. None of them understood that the biggest financial secret in that room belonged to me. And none of them knew that before this story was over, that secret would change everything. I signed the document without changing a single word. Diane seemed almost disappointed by how easy it had been. She gathered the papers, slid them neatly back into a leather folder, and offered a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Dinner continued after that, but something had shifted. The conversation moved to vacation plans, home renovations, and a cousin who had recently moved to Arizona, yet I barely heard any of it. Instead, I watched. My grandfather used to tell me that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed a matter had already been settled. That night, the Walker family believed they had settled me. A few days later, Ryan invited me to his parents' house for Sunday dinner. The home sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees and carefully trimmed lawns. It was a beautiful property, large enough to impress visitors without appearing extravagant. Diane loved that balance. She often spoke about appearances, what people noticed, what people assumed, what reflected well on the family. As I stood in the kitchen helping set out serving dishes, I listened to Diane discuss a planned update to the living room. She wanted new custom cabinets and imported stone around the fireplace. Richard mentioned increasing property taxes. Diane dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. "This house is worth every penny," she said proudly. I smiled and said nothing. Every month, a payment moved quietly through a chain of accounts connected to the trust established by my grandfather. The Walker family had no idea. To them, the house represented decades of their own success. The truth was more complicated than that. Years earlier, an investment company associated with the trust had acquired a portfolio of residential loans. One of those loans happened to be attached to this house. I had discovered the connection only after Ryan introduced me to his family. Even then, I chose to remain silent. Not because I wanted leverage, not because I wanted power, simply because it never seemed necessary. Until recently, during dinner, Diane asked another question that sounded innocent on the surface. "Have you and Ryan discussed combining finances after the wedding?" she asked. The room grew slightly quieter. Ryan took a sip of water. Richard focused on cutting his steak. I noticed these reactions because they had become familiar. The family often asked questions that seemed rehearsed. Questions designed to gather information while revealing very little in return. "We have discussed some things," I replied carefully. Diane nodded. "Financial compatibility is important." Her tone was pleasant. Her meaning was not difficult to understand. Later that evening, while helping clear the table, I caught a glimpse of Ryan standing alone near the back patio doors. He looked tired. For the first time, I wondered how long he had been caught between loyalty to his family and loyalty to me. "Are you all right?" I asked quietly. He hesitated before answering. "My parents can be intense sometimes." It was not much of a defense. Still, it was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. On the drive home, city lights blurred across my windshield as rain began tapping softly against the glass. I thought about trust, not the financial kind, the human kind, the kind that allowed two people to build a future together. The prenup itself did not bother me anymore. What bothered me was the growing feeling that I was being measured by people who had already decided my value before they truly knew me. And deep down, I had the uneasy sense that the worst was still ahead. The following Friday, Ryan invited me to a family gathering at a country club just outside the city. It was supposed to be informal, the kind of event where people mingled on the patio, discussed business, and enjoyed a pleasant evening before the weekend. The weather was perfect. A warm breeze moved through the trees, and the setting sun painted the golf course in shades of gold. On the surface, everything looked relaxed. Underneath, I felt the same tension that had been building for weeks. Diane greeted me with a polite smile and a brief hug that felt more ceremonial than affectionate. Richard shook my hand. Several relatives introduced themselves, and before long, I found myself answering questions that sounded strangely familiar. One cousin wanted to know whether I planned to continue working after marriage. An aunt asked if Ryan would be managing most of the household finances. Another relative casually mentioned real estate values and wondered aloud whether young couples today could afford homes without family assistance. The questions came one after another, each wrapped in friendliness, each somehow circling back to money. I answered politely. I always did. Yet as the evening continued, I noticed something else. Whenever I spoke about my career, the conversation quickly changed direction. Whenever Ryan mentioned one of my accomplishments, someone redirected attention elsewhere. It was subtle enough that an outsider might never notice it. But once I saw the pattern, I could not stop seeing it. Later that evening, I stepped inside to get a glass of water. The hallway leading toward the banquet rooms was quiet. As I approached a partially open door, I heard voices. I recognized Diane immediately. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I nearly kept walking. Then I heard my name. I stopped. "At least she signed it without a fight," Diane said. Someone laughed softly. Another voice asked whether I had seemed upset. No, Diane replied. She knows Ryan is her best opportunity. That is why she was so agreeable. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they were sincere. Diane believed them. In her mind, she had already decided who I was. A woman looking for security. A woman fortunate to be accepted by their family. A woman with far less to offer than their son. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the patterned carpet beneath my feet. Then I quietly walked away before anyone noticed I had been nearby. Back outside, the laughter and conversation continued. Glasses clinked. Music drifted through hidden speakers. The evening looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But something inside me had changed. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether I was being unfair to Diane. I stopped searching for innocent explanations. The truth was simpler. She did not know me, and she had never cared to. She preferred her assumptions. When Ryan found me standing near the edge of the terrace overlooking the course, he smiled and slipped an arm around my shoulders. "Everything okay?" he asked. I looked out across the fading sunlight and nodded. "Yes," I said softly. And in that moment, I realized I was beginning to understand this family far better than they understood me. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped trying to win Diane's approval. That realization brought an unexpected sense of calm. Before then, I had spent months giving people the benefit of the doubt. I had interpreted criticism as concern and judgment as protectiveness. Now I simply observed. The more I observed, the more I noticed. Ryan and I met for dinner one evening at a small Italian restaurant near the waterfront. Halfway through the meal, he mentioned that his parents were considering refinancing part of their mortgage to help fund several upgrades to the house. The comment caught my attention, though I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds like a major decision," I said. Ryan shrugged. "My mother thinks it is the right time. Property values are strong." Then he laughed lightly. "She treats that house like it is the family crown jewel." I smiled politely and took a sip of water. If only he knew how complicated that statement really was. A few days later, I received a routine quarterly report from Victoria Hayes, the manager responsible for overseeing portions of my grandfather's trust. I sat at my kitchen table on a quiet Saturday morning reviewing the documents. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink. A mug of coffee sat beside me. Most of the information was familiar. Investment performance, property holdings, loan portfolios. Then I reached a section that listed residential assets. There it was again. The address. The Walker family home. Seeing it in black and white produced a strange feeling. I had known about the connection for months, but reading the details reminded me how little the family understood about their own situation. The trust did not own the house directly. It controlled financial interests connected to the mortgage through a series of investments. Everything was completely legal and professionally managed. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. Diane worried constantly about protecting her family's financial future from me, while unknowingly benefiting from assets tied to my own family's legacy. I closed the report and stared out the window for a moment. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. He had been a patient man. He never rushed to correct people who underestimated him. "Time reveals more than arguments ever will," he used to say. Later that week, Ryan invited me to dinner at his parents' house again. The evening started pleasantly enough. Diane served roasted chicken, vegetables, and homemade rolls. Conversation remained light until dessert arrived. Then Richard casually mentioned estate planning. The subject immediately captured Diane's attention. She launched into a long discussion about protecting family wealth across generations. At one point, she looked directly at me. "Families have to be careful these days," she said. "You never know who may have different priorities." The implication was subtle but unmistakable. For a brief moment, silence settled over the table. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I simply smiled and continued stirring my coffee. Diane seemed disappointed by my lack of reaction. She wanted a response. She wanted reassurance. Perhaps she wanted proof that her comments could still unsettle me. Instead, I gave her nothing. By the time I drove home that evening, I understood something important. Diane believed she was protecting her family from a potential threat. The problem was that she had completely misidentified where the real power in the situation actually existed. And with every passing day, that misunderstanding was bringing all of us closer to a moment none of them were prepared for. About a week later, the Walker family hosted a small gathering to celebrate Ryan's promotion. It took place at their house on a warm Saturday afternoon. Friends, neighbors, and extended relatives moved through the backyard carrying drinks and balancing paper plates filled with food. Everyone seemed relaxed. Diane was in her element, greeting guests and making sure every detail reflected the image she wanted to project. I arrived carrying a simple gift for Ryan and spent most of the afternoon listening rather than talking. By then, I had learned that silence often revealed more than conversation. As the hours passed, I noticed the familiar pattern again. Diane loved discussing success stories. She spoke proudly about investments, property values, and long-term planning. Several guests complimented the house, and each compliment seemed to brighten her mood. "We worked very hard for everything we have," she said more than once. Richard nodded in agreement each time. I stood nearby, smiling politely. The irony never stopped being remarkable. Later in the afternoon, a neighbor asked how Ryan and I were handling wedding planning. Before either of us could answer, Diane stepped in. "We are making sure everything is organized properly," she said. "These days you cannot be too careful when it comes to finances." The neighbor laughed lightly, assuming it was a harmless comment. I noticed Ryan glance down at his drink. He had started recognizing the tension too. That evening, after most guests had left, I helped carry dishes into the kitchen. Through the open doorway leading toward the den, I could hear voices. Diane and Richard were speaking with one of Richard's longtime friends. Their conversation drifted naturally toward family matters. "At least Ryan is thinking practically," Diane said. "Too many people let emotions cloud important decisions." Her friend asked what she meant. Diane lowered her voice slightly, but not enough. The agreement was important. You never really know someone's intentions. There was a pause. Then came a quiet laugh. "Some people become very interested in a family once they see what the family owns." I froze for a moment beside the sink. Not because the comment surprised me. It did not. What surprised me was how comfortable she felt. Saying it, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She truly believed the story she had created about me. I finished placing the dishes in the dishwasher and stepped outside through the back door. The evening air felt cooler now. The sky was turning shades of purple and deep blue as the sun disappeared beyond the trees. Ryan joined me a few minutes later. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he sighed. "My parents can be difficult." I looked at him carefully. "Do you agree with them?" He hesitated long enough to answer the question without speaking. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. The honesty hurt, but it was still honesty. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened over the previous months. The questions, the assumptions, the comments delivered with polite smiles. More than anything, I thought about confidence. Diane was so certain she understood exactly who I was. She was so certain she had protected her family from risk. Yet the foundation of that certainty rested on information that was incomplete. And incomplete information has a way of creating very expensive mistakes. For the first time, I began to wonder how the Walker family would react if the truth ever surfaced on its own. Something told me that moment might arrive sooner than any of us expected. The next major step in the wedding process arrived sooner than I expected. Diane insisted on organizing a meeting with the family attorney to review several documents and finalize remaining details. According to her, it was simply part of being thorough. By that point, I had learned that whenever Diane described something as routine, there was usually another purpose behind it. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in a downtown office building overlooking the river. Ryan and I arrived first. A few minutes later, Diane and Richard entered carrying folders filled with notes. The attorney, Samuel Reed, greeted everyone professionally and began reviewing paperwork. Most of the discussion focused on legal language, timelines, and responsibilities. I listened quietly, answering questions whenever necessary. About halfway through the meeting, Samuel paused to clarify one section. He looked at me and asked whether I had independent legal counsel review the agreement before signing. Before I could answer, Diane spoke for me. "Claire understood everything perfectly," she said with a confident smile. Samuel nodded politely, but I noticed something in his expression. He seemed curious. Perhaps it was because I had signed so quickly. Perhaps it was because I had never attempted to negotiate. Whatever the reason, he looked at me for a moment longer than expected before continuing. After the meeting ended, everyone gathered their belongings. As we prepared to leave, Samuel handed me his business card. "If you ever have questions regarding estate planning or asset structures, "Feel free to reach out," he said. The comment seemed ordinary. Yet something about the way he said it made me wonder whether he suspected there was more to my situation than anyone realized. Outside the building, Diane appeared pleased. She treated the meeting as another victory. During the drive home, Ryan commented that his mother seemed unusually invested in every financial detail. I gave a small smile. "She likes certainty." Ryan laughed. "That is one way to describe it." A few days later, I received a call from Victoria Hayes. The quarterly reports had already been delivered, so the call itself was unusual. After exchanging greetings, she explained that a routine administrative update would soon be mailed regarding several trust-related holdings. Most beneficiaries would never notice the correspondence, but she preferred to give advance notice whenever possible. "Nothing requires action from you," she said. "I simply wanted you to be aware that some account documentation may be distributed over the next few weeks." I thanked her and ended the call. At the time, the conversation seemed insignificant. In retrospect, it became one of the most important phone calls I would receive all year. The following weekend, Ryan spent the afternoon helping his parents review estimates from contractors interested in working on the house. Diane was excited about future renovations, new cabinets, updated flooring, expanded outdoor space. Listening to her plans, I realized she spoke about the future with absolute confidence. She believed every piece of her world was secure and fully understood. Yet somewhere in a processing center, envelopes were already being prepared. Documents were already moving through administrative systems. Information that had remained invisible for years was quietly making its way toward the surface. None of us knew exactly how events would unfold, but for the first time, I could feel the situation beginning to shift. The truth was no longer sitting safely in the background. It was slowly moving closer to the people who had spent months assuming they knew everything. The following Wednesday began like any other day. I arrived at work, attended meetings, answered emails, and gave very little thought to the administrative update Victoria had mentioned during our phone call. Around noon, my cell phone vibrated. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. The moment I answered, I could tell something was different. His voice sounded tense. "Are you busy?" he asked. "A little." "What?" There was a pause. "Something strange happened at my parents' house this morning." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of strange?" Another pause followed. A letter arrived. My father opened it because he thought it was related to the mortgage. My stomach tightened slightly. I already suspected where this conversation was heading. Ryan continued. The letter referenced an entity none of us recognized. I remained silent. It mentioned something called the Bennett Family Trust. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The office around me seemed to fade into the background. Months of assumptions, questions, and quiet judgments suddenly felt much closer to colliding with reality. What exactly did the letter say? I asked carefully. I'm not completely sure. My father only showed me part of it. It looked like some kind of account update connected to the property. I stared through the glass wall of my office. Outside, people moved through the hallway carrying coffee cups and folders, completely unaware that an important shift had just begun. Did your parents understand what they were reading? I asked. Ryan laughed nervously. Not really. They spent half the morning trying to figure it out. Later that evening, Ryan called again. This time he sounded even more unsettled. According to him, Richard had contacted the mortgage servicing department seeking clarification. What started as a simple inquiry quickly became something else. The representative explained that certain ownership interests connected to the loan had changed hands years earlier through investment transactions. Additional information could be requested through formal channels. That answer only created more questions. Diane apparently spent hours reviewing old records stored in filing cabinets and boxes in the basement. None of the documents she found explained why the Bennett family trust appeared in relation to their property. By Thursday afternoon, curiosity had turned into concern. Ryan told me his parents were scheduled to speak with a financial specialist the following week. They wanted answers. They wanted certainty. Most of all, they wanted control over a situation they no longer fully understood. As I listened, I felt surprisingly calm. I had not orchestrated any of this. I had not revealed anything. The truth was simply beginning to emerge on its own. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment and looked out at the city lights beyond my window. My grandfather had often said that facts possess a quiet patience. People can ignore them for a while. They can misunderstand them. They can build entire stories around incomplete information. Eventually, however, facts have a way of introducing themselves. My phone buzzed again just before midnight. This time it was a text from Ryan. My mother wants to have dinner this weekend. She says there are some things the family needs to discuss. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. For months, Diane had believed she was evaluating me. Now, for the first time, I suspected she was beginning to realize that she had never actually known who she was evaluating at all. Saturday evening arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. When I pulled into the Walker family's driveway, I immediately noticed that the atmosphere felt different. The house looked exactly the same, as it always had. The carefully maintained lawn, the polished front door, the flower beds Diane took pride in displaying to visitors. Yet something had changed. The confidence that normally defined the household seemed absent. Diane greeted me at the door, but her smile appeared strained. Richard looked distracted. Even Ryan seemed uncertain about what would happen next. We gathered around the dining room table, though very little attention was paid to the meal. Everyone knew the real purpose of the evening. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and placed several papers on the table. "We spent the week speaking with financial advisors," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. Diane folded her hands together and looked directly at me. "There is something we do not understand." I nodded politely and waited. Richard slid one document forward. Across the top appeared the familiar name that had caused so much confusion: the Bennett Family Trust. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Diane broke the silence. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked. The room became perfectly still. Ryan looked from his parents to me. I could see the realization beginning to form in his eyes. Slowly, I set down my glass of water. "Yes," I said. "I know about it." Diane blinked. Richard leaned forward slightly. Ryan stared at me in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Diane asked. I took a breath. There was no anger in me anymore. No desire for revenge. Only the simple truth. "The trust was established by my grandfather many years ago," I explained. "I am one of its beneficiaries." Nobody interrupted. Several years ago, some investment groups connected to the trust acquired interests in residential mortgage portfolios. One of those portfolios included this property. Richard's face lost color. Diane looked completely stunned. Ryan remained silent. I continued speaking calmly. "I did not create the arrangement. I did not choose this specific property. The connection existed long before I met Ryan." For several seconds, the only sound in the room came from the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, Richard spoke. "Are you telling us that the trust has financial interests connected to this house?" "Yes." Diane looked down at the documents and then back at me. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "And you knew this the entire time?" "For months," I answered honestly. The silence that followed felt enormous. Every conversation from the previous year seemed to settle over the table at once. Every question, every assumption, every warning disguised as advice. Ryan rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Why did you never say anything?" he asked quietly. I looked at him. "Because it never seemed important to me." That answer landed harder than any argument could have. Diane stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. The woman she believed needed protection from their family suddenly no longer existed. In her place stood someone she had never bothered to understand. As the evening continued, more questions followed. I answered each one calmly. No boasting, no lectures, just facts. And with every answer, the story the Walker family had created about me began to unravel. By the time dinner ended, one thing had become impossible to ignore. The person they spent months trying to evaluate had been holding a reality they never imagined. And now that reality was sitting directly in front of them. The days that followed were unlike anything I had experienced since becoming engaged to Ryan. The questions stopped. The assumptions disappeared. The subtle comments about money, security, and protecting family interests vanished almost overnight. In their place came something far more uncomfortable. Silence. Diane called twice during the following week. The first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. The second lasted even less. She sounded polite, but there was an uncertainty in her voice that had never been there before. For the first time since I met her, she did not seem completely sure of her own position. Richard was much the same. According to Ryan, he spent several days reviewing documents and speaking with advisors. Not because there was a problem to solve, but because he wanted to understand how they had misunderstood the situation so completely. One evening, Ryan came to my apartment, carrying takeout from our favorite restaurant. We sat by the window overlooking the city and talked for hours. Eventually, the conversation turned toward his parents. "They feel embarrassed," he admitted quietly. I nodded. That did not surprise me. "I never wanted them to feel embarrassed," I said. "I know." Ryan stared out at the lights below. "The difficult part is realizing how many conclusions they reached without knowing the facts." I looked at him carefully. Not just them. He understood what I meant immediately. For months he had stood between us, avoiding conflict, hoping everything would somehow resolve itself. Instead, his silence had allowed misunderstandings to grow. He lowered his eyes. "You are right." A week later, Diane invited me to lunch. We met at a small cafe near the waterfront, the same type of place where months earlier she might have asked questions designed to evaluate me. This time was different. After a few minutes of conversation, she placed her coffee cup down and looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology." The words seemed difficult for her to say. "I made assumptions about you. Many of them." I listened quietly. "I thought I was protecting my family," she continued. "But looking back, I realize I spent more time judging you than getting to know you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled gently. "We all make mistakes." Diane nodded. Her eyes drifted toward the window. "Some mistakes are more expensive than others." It was the closest either of us came to discussing the irony directly. By the end of lunch, something had changed. Not because trust had been instantly repaired. Trust does not work that way. It takes time. But for the first time, the conversation felt honest. Several days later, Ryan came to see me again. This time he carried a folder. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and slid it forward. I immediately recognized the document inside. The agreement that had caused so much tension from the beginning. Ryan looked nervous. "I have been thinking a lot about what happened." I waited. "The problem was never the paperwork," he said. "The problem was that everyone focused on protecting assets instead of building trust." Then he pushed the folder toward me. "I do not want our future to start this way." I looked at him for a long moment before closing the folder and setting it aside. Outside the window, the afternoon sun reflected off nearby buildings. Everything felt strangely peaceful. My grandfather used to say that character reveals itself when money enters the conversation. Looking back, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The trust, the house, the documents, and the assumptions were never the real story. The real story was how people treated one another when they believed someone had less power than they did. In the end, the greatest lesson was not about wealth at all. It was about respect. And once the truth finally surfaced, everyone in the Walker family learned that lesson in a way none of us would ever forget.